And indeed, as regards the working of the speculative faculty in the creation of history, it is in all respects marvelous how that the most truthful accounts of the passage from barbarism to civilization in ancient literature come from the works of poets. The elaborate researches of Mr. Taylor and Sir John Lubbock have done little more than verify the theories put forward in the Prometheus Bound and the De Natura Rerum, yet neither Aeschylus nor Lucretius followed in the modern path, but rather attained to truth by a certain almost mystical power of creative imagination, such as we now seek to banish from science as a dangerous power, though to its science seems to owe many of its most splendid generalities, notably, of course, in the case of heat and its laws. Leaving then the question of origin of society as treated by the ancients, I shall now turn to the other and more important question of how far they may be said to have attained to what we call the philosophy of history. Now at the outset we must note that while the conceptions of law and order have been universally received as the governing principles of the phenomena of nature in the sphere of physical science, yet their intrusion into the domain of history and the life of man has always been met with a strong opposition, on the ground of the incalculable nature of two great forces acting on human action: a certain causeless spontaneity, which men call free will, and the extranatural interference, which they attribute as a constant attribute to God. Now that there is a science of the apparently variable phenomena of history is a conception which we have perhaps only recently begun to appreciate. Yet, like all other great thoughts, it seems to have come to the Greek mind spontaneously, through a certain splendor of imagination, in the morning tide of their civilization, before inductive research had armed them with the instruments of verification. For I think it is possible to discern in some of the mystic speculations of the early Greek thinkers that desire to discover what is that invariable existence of which there are variable states, and to incorporate it in some formula of law which may serve to explain the different manifestations of all organic bodies, man included, which is the germ of the philosophy of history. The germ, indeed, of an idea of which it is not too much to say that on any kind of historical criticism worthy of the name must ultimately rest. For the very first requisite for any scientific conception of history is the doctrine of uniform sequence. In other words, that certain events having happened, certain other events corresponding to them will happen also, that the past is the key of the future. Now at the birth of this great conception, science, it is true, prescribed, yet religion it was which at the outset clothed in its own garb and familiarized men with it by appealing to their hearts first, and then to their intellects, knowing that at the beginning of things it is through the moral nature and not through the intellectual that great truths are spread. So in Herodotus, who may be taken as a representative of the orthodox tone of thought, the idea of uniform sequence of cause and effect appears under the theological aspect of nemesis and providence, which is really the scientific conception of law, only it is viewed from an ethical standpoint. Now in Thucydides, the philosophy of history rests on the probability, which the uniformity of human nature affords us, that the future will in the course of human things resemble the past, if not reproduce it. He appears to contemplate a recurrence of the phenomena of history, as equally certain with the return of the epidemic of the Great Plague. Notwithstanding what German critics have written on the subject, we must beware of regarding this conception as a mere reproduction of that cyclic history theory of events which sees in the world nothing but the rotation of strophe and antistrophe in the eternal choir of life and death. For in his remarks on the excesses of the Corsairian Revolution, Thucydides distinctly rests his ideas of the recurrence of history on the psychological grounds of the general sameness of mankind. The sufferings, he says, which revolution entailed upon the cities were many and terrible, such as have occurred and always will occur, as long as human nature remains the same, though in a severer or milder form, and varying in their symptoms according to the variety of the particular cases. In peace and prosperity, states and individuals have better sentiments, because they are not confronted with imperious necessities, but war takes away the easy supply of men's wants, and so proves a hard taskmaster, which brings most men's characters to a level with their fortunes. It is evident that here Thucydides is ready to admit the variety of manifestations which external causes bring about in their workings on the uniform character of the nature of men. Yet after all is said, these are perhaps but very general statements. The ordinary effects of peace and war are dwelt on, but there is no real analysis of the immediate causes and general laws of the phenomena of life. Nor does Thucydides seem to recognize the truth that if humanity proceeds in circles, the circles are always widening. Perhaps we may say that with him the philosophy of history is partly in the metaphysical stage, and see in the progress of this idea, from Herodotus to Polybius, the exemplification of the Comtian law of the three states of thought, the theological, the metaphysical, and the scientific. For truly, out of the vagueness of theological mysticism, this conception which we call the philosophy of history was raised to a scientific principle, according to which the past was explained and the future predicted by reference to general laws. Now, just as the earliest account of the nature of the progress of humanity is to be found in Plato, so in him we find the first explicit attempt to found a universal philosophy of history upon wide rational grounds. Having created an ideally perfect state, the philosopher proceeds to give an elaborate theory of the complex causes which produce revolutions, of the moral effects of various forms of government and education, of the rise of the criminal classes and their connections with pauperism, and, in a word, to create history by the deductive method and to proceed from a priori psychological principles to discover the governing laws of the apparent chaos of political life. There have been many attempts since Plato to deduce from a single philosophical principle all the phenomena which experience subsequently verifies for us. Fichte thought he could predict the world plan from the idea of universal time. Hegel dreamed that he had found the key to the mysteries of life in the development of freedom. And Krauss in the categories of being. But the one scientific basis on which the true philosophy of history must rest is the complete knowledge of the laws of human nature in all its wants, its aspirations, its powers, and its tendencies. And this great truth, which Thucydides may be said in some measure to have apprehended, was given to us first by Plato. Now it cannot be accurately said of this philosopher that either his philosophy or his history is entirely and simply a priori. On est de son siècle même quand on y proteste. A man belongs to his age, even when he struggles against it. And so we find in him continual references to the Spartan mode of life, the Pythagorean system, the general characteristics of Greek tyrannies and Greek democracies. For while in his account of the method of forming an ideal state, he says that the political artist is indeed to fix his gaze on the sun of abstract truth in the heavens of the pure reason, but is sometimes to turn to the realization of the ideals on earth. Yet after all, the general character of the Platonic method, which is what we are especially concerned with, is essentially deductive and a priori. And he himself, in the building up of his Nepholakachagia, certainly starts with a clean sheet, making a clean sweep of all history and all experience. And it was essentially as an a priori theorist that he is criticized by Aristotle, as we shall see later. To proceed to closer details regarding the actual scheme of the laws of political revolutions as drawn out by Plato, we must first note that the primary cause of the decay of the ideal state is the general principle, common to the vegetable and animal worlds, as well as to the world of history, that all created things are fated to decay, a principle which, though expressed in the terms of a mere metaphysical abstraction, is yet perhaps in its essence scientific. For we too must hold that a continuous redistribution of matter and motion is the inevitable truth of the normal persistence of force, and that perfect equilibrium is as impossible in politics as it certainly is in physics. The secondary causes, which mar the perfection of the Platonic city of the sun, are to be found in the intellectual decay of the race consequent on insidious marriages and in the Philistine elevation of physical achievements over mental culture, while the hierarchical succession of the timocracy, the oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny is dwelt on at great length, and its causes analyzed in a very dramatic and psychological manner, if not in that sanctioned by the actual order of history. And indeed it is apparent at first sight that the Platonic succession of states represents rather the succession of ideas in the philosophic mind than any historical succession of time. Aristotle meets the whole simply by an appeal to facts. If the theory of the periodic decay of all created things here to be scientific, it must be universal and so true of all the other states as well as of the ideal. Besides, a state usually changes into its contrary, and not the form next to it. So the ideal state would not change to timocracy, while oligarchy, more often than tyranny, succeeds democracy. Plato, besides, says nothing of what a tyranny would change to. According to the cycle theory, it ought to pass into the ideal state again, but as a fact, one tyranny is changed into another, as at Sicyon, or into the democracy, as at Syracuse, or into an aristocracy, as at Carthage. The example of Sicily, too, shows that an oligarchy is often followed by a tyranny, as at Leontini and Gela. Besides, it is absurd to represent greed as the chief motive of decay, or to talk of avarice as the root of oligarchy, when nearly all true oligarchies, money is forbidden by law, or money-making is forbidden by law. And finally, the Platonic theory neglects the different kinds of democracies and of tyrannies. Now, nothing can be more important than this passage in Aristotle's Politics, which may be said to mark an era in the evolution of historical criticism. For there is nothing on which Aristotle insists so strongly as that the generalizations from facts ought to be added to the data of the a priori method, a principle which we know to be true not merely of deductive speculative politics, but of physics also. For are not the residual phenomena of chemists a valuable source of improvement in theory? His own method is essentially historical, though by no means empirical. On the contrary, this far-seeing thinker rigidly stated, "Il maestro di color que sanno." I think that was Italian, and I just pronounced it in Spanish. The matter of those who know may be said to have apprehended clearly that the true method is neither exclusively empirical nor exclusively speculative, but rather a union of both in the process called analysis or interpretation of facts, which has been defined as the application of facts of such general conceptions as may fix the important characteristics of the phenomena and present them permanently in their true relations. He, too, was the first to point out what even in our own day is incompletely appreciated, that nature, including the development of man, is not full of incoherent episodes like a bad tragedy. That inconsistency and anomaly are as impossible in the moral as they are in the physical world, and that where the superficial observer thinks he sees a revolution, the philosophical critic discerns merely the gradual and rational evolution of the inevitable results of certain antecedents. And while admitting the necessity of a psychological basis for the philosophy of history, he added it to the important truth that man, to be apprehended in his proper position in the universe, as well as in his natural powers, must be studied from below in the hierarchical progression of higher function from the lower forms of life. The important maxim that to obtain a clear conception of anything we must study it in its growth from the very beginning is formally set down in the opening of Politics, where indeed we shall find the other characteristics featured of the modern evolutionary theory, such as the differentiation of function and the survival of the fittest, explicitly set forth. What a valuable step this was in the improvement of the method of historical criticism, it is needless to point out. By it one may say that true thread was given to guide one's steps through the bewildering labyrinth of facts. For history, to use terms with which Aristotle has made us familiar, may be looked at from two essentially different standpoints, either as a work of art whose end or aim or final cause is external to it and imposed on it from without, or as an organism containing the law of its own development in itself, and working out its perfection merely by the fact of being what it is. Now, if we adopt the former, which we may style the theological view, we shall be in continual danger of tripping into the pitfall of some a priori conclusion, that bourne from which it has been truly said, no traveler ever returns. The latter is the only scientific theory, and was apprehended in its fullness by Aristotle, whose application of the inductive method to history, and whose employment of the evolutionary theory of humanity, show that he was conscious that the philosophy of history is nothing separate from the facts of history, but is contained in them, and that the rational law of the complex phenomena of life, like the ideal in the world of thought, is to be reached through the facts, not superimposed on them. Reasoning from the multiplicity of experience. And finally, in estimating the enormous debt which the science of historical criticism owes to Aristotle, we must not pass over his attitude towards those two great difficulties in the formation of a philosophy of history on which I have touched above. I mean the assertion of extranatural interference with the normal development of the world and of the incalculable influence exercised by the power of free will. Now, as regards the former, he may be said to have neglected it entirely. The special acts of providence proceeding from God's immediate government of the world, where Herodotus saw his mighty landmarks in history, would have been to him essentially disturbing elements in that universal reign of law, the extent of whose limitless empire he of all the great thinkers of antiquity was the first explicitly to recognize. Standing aloof from the popular religion as well as from the deeper conceptions of Herodotus and the tragic school, he no longer thought of God as one with fair limbs and treacherous face, haunting wood and glade, nor would he see him in a jealous judge, continually interfering in the world's history to bring the wicked to punishment and the proud to a fall. God to him was the incarnation of pure intellect, a being whose activity was the contemplation of his own perfection, one whom philosophy might imitate, but whom prayers could never move, to the sublime indifference of whose passionless wisdom what were the sons of men, their desires, or their sins. While as regards the other difficulty in the formation of a philosophy of history, the conflict of free will with the general laws appears first in Greek thought, in the usual theological form in which all great ideas seem to be cradled at their birth. It was such legends as those of Oedipus and Adrastus, exemplifying the struggles of individual humanity against the overpowering force of circumstances and necessity, which gave to the early Greeks the same lessons which we of modern days draw, in somewhat less artistic fashion, from the study of statistics and the laws of physiology. In Aristotle, of course, there is no trace of supernatural influence. The furies which drive their victim into sin first and then punishment are no longer viper-tressed goddesses with eyes and mouth of flame, but those evil thoughts which harbor within the impure soul. In this, as in all other points, to arrive at Aristotle is to reach the pure atmosphere of scientific and modern thought. But while he rejected pure necessitarianism in its crude form as essentially as reductio ad absurdum of life, he was fully conscious of the fact that the will is not a mysterious and ultimate unit of force beyond which we cannot go and whose special characteristics is inconsistency, but a certain creative attitude of the mind, which is from the first continually influenced by habits, education, and circumstance, so absolutely modifiable, in a word, that the good and the bad men alike seem to lose the power of free will. For the one is morally unable to sin, the other physically incapacitated for reformation. And of the influence of climate and temperature in forming the nature of man, a conception perhaps pressed too far in modern days when the race theory is supposed to be a sufficient explanation of the Hindu, and the latitude and longitude of a country the best guide to its morals. Cousin errs a good deal in this respect, to say as he did, "Give me the latitude and longitude of a country, its rivers and its mountains, and I will deduce the race," is surely a glaring exaggeration. Aristotle is completely unaware. I do not allude to such smaller points as the oligarchical tendencies of a horse-breeding country and the democratic influence of the proximity of the sea, important though they are for the consideration of Greek history, but rather to those wider views in the 7th book of his Politics, where he attributes the happy union in the Greek character of intellectual attainments with the spirit of progress to the temperate climate they enjoyed, and points out how the extreme cold of the north dulls the mental faculties of its inhabitants and renders them incapable of social organization over extended empire, while to the enervating heat of eastern countries was due to want of spirit and bravery, which then as now was the characteristic of the population in that quarter of the globe.